The bride screamed when she discovered the wedding photograph in her groom's pocket, taken in 1945 with another woman. 28-year-old Elizabeth Madden was just moments away from walking down the aisle when she decided to slip a handwritten note into her soon-to-be husband's jacket. As she reached into the inner pocket of his perfectly tailored suit, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a weathered, yellowed photograph. Curious, she pulled it out and froze. The image showed her fiancé, Richard Werner, standing proudly in a wedding suit next to a smiling young woman in a white dress. The date scrawled on the back read April 12, 1945. The problem wasn't just that Richard appeared to have been married before. It was that in 1945, Richard Werner would have been only 7 years old. And the man in the photograph wasn't just similar to her fiancé. It was identical, down to the small scar above his right eyebrow. But what made Elizabeth's blood run cold wasn't just the impossible photograph. It was what she found stitched inside the lining of his jacket, a small, carefully preserved patch bearing the unmistakable double lightning bolt insignia of the Nazi SS. When confronted, Richard's face didn't register shock or confusion, just a cold, calculating stillness that Elizabeth had never seen before. His eyes seemed to change, hardening into something ancient and terrible. By that evening, Elizabeth had vanished without a trace, and Richard Werner was nowhere to be found. Dr. Evelyn Keller, lead investigator with the Historical Crimes Division of Interpol, received the case file 3 days later. A respected forensic historian with over 15 years of experience in war crimes investigations, Dr. Keller had encountered many disturbing cases involving former Nazi officials who had escaped justice. But this case was different, impossible even. The photograph was authenticated by 3 independent experts, confirming it genuinely dated from 1945. Facial recognition software showed a 99.8% match between the groom in the old photograph and recent images of Richard Werner. Initially, we assumed this was a case of a descendant taking on a relative's identity, Dr. Keller explained. But the DNA evidence complicated everything. Blood samples from Richard's apartment matched the DNA recovered from the preserved SS insignia. More disturbing were the carbon dating results from a strand of hair found attached to the insignia. It dated to approximately 75 years ago. When investigators searched Richard's apartment, they found it completely emptied. The only item left behind was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with entries spanning decades, written in the same handwriting. The earliest entry was dated 1938. The most recent had been written the morning of the wedding. What the journal contained sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Detailed accounts of Nazi operations, not from historical research, but written in first-person perspective with intimate details never documented in official records. Names of victims, locations of mass graves, and experimental procedures performed at concentration camps, all described with clinical detachment. But interspersed between these horrific accounts were passages that defied rational explanation. References to the procedure and renewal cycles appeared throughout, alongside calculations for something called cellular regression maintenance. One passage, dated June 21, 1973, read, "Third renewal completed successfully. The pain diminishes with each cycle. 30 years regained." Finding compatible donors becomes increasingly difficult. One investigator was so disturbed by the contents that he immediately resigned from the force. Another had to be hospitalized after suffering an extreme psychological breakdown while transcribing a particularly graphic entry describing human experimentation. These weren't the ramblings of a delusional mind, Dr. Keller noted. The details aligned perfectly with classified historical records, details no ordinary person could know without having been there. The most chilling discovery came when investigators cross-referenced the names mentioned in the journal with historical records. 7 different identities were detailed, each with approximately 30 years of documentation before disappearing and being replaced by a new identity.
Each disappearance coincided with what the journal called a renewal cycle. Most disturbing of all, photographs recovered for each identity showed the same man at the same apparent age, despite spanning over 7 decades. Elizabeth's parents received a postcard 3 weeks after her disappearance. The postmark showed it had been sent from Buenos Aires, Argentina, a country notorious for harboring Nazi fugitives after World War II. The message, written in Elizabeth's handwriting, was brief. "I'm safe. Don't look for me. You wouldn't understand what I've discovered." Forensic analysis confirmed it was indeed Elizabeth's handwriting, but something about the pressure and stroke pattern suggested extreme duress. When investigators turned the postcard over, they found a wedding photograph. Elizabeth and Richard, both smiling, though her eyes held something that resembled terror more than joy. Dr. Keller traveled to Argentina immediately. Working with local authorities, she traced the postcard to a remote compound in the Patagonian wilderness. By the time they reached the location, the buildings had been burned to the ground. Among the ashes, they found medical equipment of both vintage and startlingly advanced design. A hidden underground chamber contained 7 cryogenic preservation units. 6 were empty. The 7th contained the body of a young woman, not Elizabeth, who had been dead approximately 70 years according to initial examinations, yet showed no signs of decomposition. What happened next forced the authorities to classify the entire investigation. The dead woman's fingerprints matched those of Richard Werner's grandmother, who had reportedly died in 1945 at the age of 26. Further DNA testing confirmed she was the woman from the original wedding photograph. Even more impossible, tissue samples showed active cellular regeneration despite clinical death. "Something was keeping her cells alive," whispered one medical examiner who refused to continue working on the case afterward. 70 years after death, and her cells were still dividing. That's not just impossible, it's monstrous. The search for Elizabeth intensified, expanding across 3 continents. Interpol agents reported brief sightings of the couple in Rio de Janeiro, then Cairo, then Prague, each time disappearing just hours before authorities arrived. Security footage from a private airfield in Prague showed Elizabeth walking stiffly, almost mechanically, alongside Richard. Medical experts analyzing the footage noted her movements suggested either extreme sedation or neurological manipulation. The last frame captured her turning toward the camera. Her eyes seemed to silently scream for help. 6 months into the investigation, a USB drive arrived at Dr. Keller's office. It contained thousands of documents, scanned pages from what appeared to be a Nazi research program called Project Lazarus. The files detailed experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners attempting to achieve cellular immortality through cyclical regeneration. Most subjects died horrifically, their bodies rejecting the procedures. But one subject, identified only as Patient 0, showed promising results. The lead researcher, an SS doctor named Klaus Werner, eventually used the procedure on himself. The last document was a photograph of the doctor, the same face as Richard Werner. One document explained the renewal process in clinical detail. It required a fresh genetic donor, typically a young, healthy female, whose cellular material would be harvested to rejuvenate the subject's aging cells. The process would effectively reset biological age by approximately 30 years. The donor would not survive. The documents included a list of women's names, 28 in total, spanning from 1945 to the present. Elizabeth Madden's name was the last on the list. Dr. Keller couldn't sleep for days after reading the files. "The implications were too horrible to contemplate," she later wrote in her classified report. "If even a fraction of the documents were authentic, we were dealing with something beyond conventional criminal investigation, a subject who had essentially discovered biological immortality through the most unimaginable atrocities." When the documents were shared with a select group of medical researchers under strict confidentiality, their reactions ranged from disbelief to horror. One prominent geneticist broke down sobbing after reviewing the files, calling the procedures an abomination against nature itself.
Another, more disturbingly, disappeared with copies of several key documents. He was found 3 days later in his laboratory, having apparently attempted to recreate some of the procedures on himself. The results were catastrophic. His body had aged approximately 50 years overnight before suffering complete cellular collapse. The breakthrough came when authorities intercepted a shipment of specialized medical equipment to a private clinic in Zurich, Switzerland. The order had been placed by a doctor who had been dead for 15 years, yet security footage showed a young man, bearing a striking resemblance to Richard Werner, collecting the equipment. Swiss police conducted a raid on the clinic, only to find it recently abandoned. In the basement laboratory, they discovered evidence of a hastily performed medical procedure. Blood analysis confirmed both Elizabeth's and Richard's DNA were present. What they also found was a video recording, deliberately left behind. It showed Richard Werner speaking calmly to the camera. "You're too late, as always," he began. "By the time you see this, the next renewal will be complete. Elizabeth has served her purpose, as have all the others. You cannot stop what I've become." His face suddenly contorted in what appeared to be extreme pain, the skin around his eyes momentarily sagging, showing his true age, before tightening again. 77 years of refinement. The 1,000-year Reich may have fallen, but some of us will actually live to see 1,000 years. The video ended with him cutting his palm and showing his blood to the camera, which seemed to contain microscopic metallic particles that moved with apparent purpose. Dr. Keller brought in historians specializing in Nazi occult research, a controversial but necessary step. They identified connections between Project Lazarus and the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi archaeological organization obsessed with finding mythological sources of power. Werner wasn't just conducting biological experiments, explained Dr. Keller. Heinrich Meyer, expert in Nazi occult studies, he was combining cutting-edge science with ancient alchemical practices, specifically rituals described in certain banned medieval texts that supposedly granted extended life through blood sacrifice. The investigation took an even darker turn when they discovered a pattern of missing women across Europe and South America, all bearing physical similarities to the woman in the original wedding photograph. 28 women over 75 years, disappearing approximately every 3 decades. Each disappearance preceded the emergence of a new identity for Werner. Most disturbing was the realization that Elizabeth had been selected not randomly, but specifically because of her genetic similarities to Werner's first wife, similarities that would make her an ideal donor for his next renewal. 13 months after Elizabeth's disappearance, Dr. Keller received a package containing a severed human finger. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Elizabeth Madden. Attached was a note in familiar handwriting. She fights the procedure more than the others, perhaps because she knows what's coming. Don't worry, nothing is wasted. Accompanying the finger was a small vial of blood. Testing revealed it contained both Elizabeth's DNA and the same mysterious metallic particles seen in Werner's blood from the video. The search expanded to include experts in experimental biotechnology. One researcher, after examining the particles under an electron microscope, suffered a seizure. When she regained consciousness, she could only repeat one phrase: "It's not science. It's not science." She took her own life that evening, leaving behind pages of frantic notes describing how the particles appeared to be some form of self-replicating nanotechnology, decades beyond current capabilities, merged with organic material in a way that defied existing biological principles. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A 96-year-old former concentration camp survivor contacted Dr. Keller after seeing a carefully redacted news story about the investigation. Jakob Stern had been a laboratory assistant forced to work under Dr. Klaus Werner at Auschwitz. He wasn't like the other doctors, Stern explained in his videotaped testimony. He wasn't just experimenting on prisoners. He was searching for something specific, something he called the permanence formula.
He believed certain people carried genetic markers that, when properly extracted and combined with his treatments, could defeat death itself. Stern's testimony included a critical detail. The original procedure had one fundamental flaw. Each renewal required a new genetic donor, but the subject would eventually build resistance to the treatment. Werner had calculated he could undergo the procedure approximately 9 times before complete resistance.
According to Stern's testimony, the current Richard Werner would be approaching his 9th renewal, his final opportunity to achieve permanent immortality. The investigation led to a remote island off the Norwegian coast, where satellite imagery had detected unusual energy signatures consistent with the specialized equipment stolen from the Swiss clinic. As authorities prepared to raid the location, they received one final message from Werner, a live-stream video showing Elizabeth strapped to a medical table, still alive but severely emaciated. Tubes connected her body to a complex apparatus surrounding a second table where Richard lay, his face contorted in pain. "You're about to witness history," his voice rasped through speakers. "The final renewal. No more cycles. No more donors. Permanent cellular stability." The raid commenced immediately. Special forces stormed the facility, but they were too late. They found Elizabeth's body, drained of blood and vital fluids.
Richard Werner was nowhere to be found, though security footage showed him moments after the procedure, his appearance now somehow younger, more vital than before. He walked calmly past the camera, his movements inhumanly smooth. The last frame showed him turning toward the camera, his eyes reflecting light in a way that wasn't quite human. Forensic analysis of the facility revealed technology that leading experts deemed theoretically impossible. One chamber contained what appeared to be growth-accelerated clones in various stages of development, all bearing Elizabeth's facial features but with significant genetic modifications. None survived more than a few hours after the facility was discovered. The medical equipment combined cutting-edge biotechnology with components dating back to the 1940s, some bearing the insignia of the Third Reich. The most disturbing discovery was a set of journals outlining Werner's next phase. No longer content with his own immortality, he had begun developing a method to transfer his consciousness into new, genetically engineered bodies. Elizabeth's DNA had been central to this process, selected for specific genetic markers that Werner believed would solve the final barriers to his work. The journals also contained a list of names, prominent scientists and government officials, with detailed plans for replacing them with such vessels. Dr. Keller's investigation remains officially open. International alerts have been issued for Richard Werner under 17 different known aliases. The full details of Project Lazarus remain classified at the highest levels, with only a handful of officials aware of its complete scope. Periodic sightings of Werner are reported across the globe, though none have been confirmed. Elizabeth Madden's case is officially classified as a homicide, though her parents refuse to hold a funeral, clinging to the desperate hope she might somehow still be alive. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from those who claim to have encountered Werner since his disappearance. They describe a man who seems perfectly normal until you look into his eyes, where something ancient and inhuman looks back. Several witnesses report the same disturbing detail. In moments of stress or excitement, his irises appear to contain moving metallic particles, like liquid mercury swirling behind human eyes. 3 months after the raid, Dr. Keller woke to find a wedding invitation on her bedside table, inside her locked apartment, with no signs of forced entry. It contained a single photograph showing Richard Werner standing beside a woman who looked exactly like Elizabeth Madden, yet somehow different, her eyes colder, her smile not quite reaching them. The next phase begins. You're welcome to witness it, Doctor. Security footage from Dr. Keller's apartment building showed no intruders that night. However, at precisely 3:33 in the morning, the cameras captured a momentary electrical disturbance. When the image cleared, the hallway outside her apartment contained a figure that appeared to be Elizabeth Madden.
standing perfectly still, staring directly into the camera, with eyes that reflected light like polished metal. The figure's mouth moved, forming words that lip-reading experts later translated, "He's coming for all of you next." The investigation continues, though many of the original team members have requested transfers, suffered psychological breakdowns, or disappeared altogether. Reports of people acting strangely, loved ones suddenly seeming like strangers in familiar bodies, have increased in regions where Werner sightings were reported.
Medical facilities in these areas report anomalous blood samples containing unidentifiable metallic particles. Dr. Keller now works alone, having lost trust in her colleagues after 3 were discovered to have subtle surgical scars behind their ears, scars matching those described in Werner's journals as necessary for vessel preparation. Her latest report, filed directly to Interpol's highest authorities, ends with a warning. This isn't just a criminal investigation anymore. If Werner has succeeded, what we're facing is nothing less than the covert infiltration of humanity itself. The true extent of Richard Werner's, or Klaus Werner's, success remains unknown. But one question haunts those few who know the complete file. If a Nazi doctor discovered the secret to immortality 75 years ago, how many others might have done the same?
How many former Nazi officials didn't escape to Argentina or Brazil, but instead walked into new identities, new bodies, new lives, aging decades more slowly than those around them, patient enough to wait for the world to forget their faces before emerging again? What would you do if you discovered someone close to you had surgical scars you couldn't explain? Have you ever looked at a loved one and momentarily felt they were someone else entirely behind familiar eyes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to our channel for more historical investigations into the darkest corners of human history. Some secrets were buried for a reason, but the truth cannot remain hidden forever.